Good morning, and thank you, Craig. Job, career, calling. As Craig talked about, we use those words frequently here. In fact, sometimes we even interchange them. But what do we actually mean when we're utilizing each and every term? As I started studying in this, I went to Amazon and I looked under the professional and technical sections, and there were over 12,000 titles that had one of those words in it. And so it's out there, the concepts are out there, and it's huge, and it's sometimes overwhelming and confusing. My goal for us today is to really just start to open the dialogue, to start to have you begin to think about what are the differences, and really most importantly, what are you seeking as you come to job seekers each morning? A job, a career, or a calling? Let me share with you just a couple different job seekers and their profiles. First of all, meet Matt. After 10 years with a firm, Matt was laid off, and he is just really up in arms over this. He can't really say that he liked his job. In fact, most days he suffered from tension headaches. He counted the hours until that job was over that day. He was counting the years until he could retire. But it did afford him and his family a comfortable lifestyle, a house, and an environment for them to live a comfortable life. With this layoff, however, some things that Matt had successfully kind of put on a back burner have surfaced. Issues like a troubled marriage, issues like dealing with difficult kiddos. And so he spends as much time working on that troubled marriage, working with his children, as he does on the job search. Right now, he actually feels like he'd just like to get out of the house, and he needs an income. He doesn't really have the time to spend on investing in his health, in investing in his community, or investing in his time with God. Matt needs a job, and he needs it now. Now meet Jenna. Jenna completed her MBA and landed the dream job with an investment firm. She was making steady progress with this organization until they lost a major client, her client. With the decrease in revenue, the firm has had to also decrease some positions, and that includes Jenna's position. She has taken the time to invest in herself from a continuing education stance. She's taken the time to also be very involved with the professional organization. In fact, she was recently just elected as the president of the Austin area organization for her field. And so that'll be great for her for networking and for looking outside of the Austin area. But Jenna really wants this next position to count. She was looking at a promotion looming until they lost this client. And so now she wants this next position to potentially have more money and more responsibility. She used to like to hike. Sorry about that. She used to like to hike and spend time with friends. And yes, she would really enjoy the opportunity to think about a longer relationship instead of just occasional dates. But at this point, everything needs to take a back seat to those financial and to those career goals that she set for herself in graduate school. Jenna is seeking a career, or the next rung in her career ladder. Now finally meet Sean. Sean is in his third transition after pursuing 2 different fields that didn't work out. He vows this time, though, he's going to make a count, as he's going to stop and take stock on how he's wired, what makes him tick, what are his interests, what's his personality, and he's going to seek a new position that's a really great fit for him, as well as one that gives meaning and significance to his days. He knows it's going to take some part on him for him to really do this, and so he realizes also as he looks at making a career change that he's not going to do a very good job of communicating what he has to offer to an employer until he does take stock in this. But even before he heard about the concept of a calling, he realized he was off on the wrong path with those last 2 career fields. His family means the world to him, and as he's taking the time to do this investigation, if he needs to, he'll take a bridge job in order to make ends meet. He and his wife are working to become debt-free. They're cutting back where they can, and they feel like this is the best gift that they can give to their children. He does seek to find some opportunities to contribute back to the community, which gives him great significance and a feeling of satisfaction. So every week, He serves in an organization that means a lot to him. And he's also spending time with God. He feels like, how can I possibly hear where I'm being called if I'm not taking the time to listen? Sean is pursuing his life calling. Now, each of these different profiles that I've just given you are not real people, but they are definitely representative of the people, the thousands of people that have come through Job Seekers over the last 4 years. They were all seeking something that we could help them with. They were all coming here every Monday morning and were gaining that next step that they needed in whatever they were pursuing. But our heartbeat, as Craig talked about at the very beginning, is really to help each and every one of you kind of move above and beyond that concept of I'm looking for my next job or I'm looking for that next rung in my career ladder, and instead look at pursuing a life calling. That place where all the different ways that you've been made, as well as all the different parts of your life, come together to give your life significance and meaning. Let's take a chance to kind of look at what the actual definitions of each of these terms are. I'm a word person, and as I start out studying anything, I really like to understand them really from the root. And so as you look at job, career, calling, you get some definite insights as to what do we mean by the differences. One is for the job, I love that old obsolete English, and it means a lump. But as you look at it, it really does portray into the definition of if it was a piece of work or a task. It was something that had to be done. As you transition over into career, you see that it comes from the Latin, which is from car, which means to run, or carraria, which is a road or a path. And that certainly is portrayed in the definition, where you're looking at a path, a pursuit to follow within your career. I think my favorite, however, in there is the very last one, which says to go top speed in a headlong manner. I think some of us do that as we're pursuing our career. We're just kind of going headlong, and we're not really necessarily stopping as we go along. As we transition over into calling, we see two different roots. One is from the Greek, which is kaleo, which means to summon or call or invite. As we look at the Latin, though, we get a deeper meaning, as we see that it still has that idea of a call or to invite, but it has a divine purpose with it, or a destiny. It is where we get, the vocare is where we get all the words for vocal, and so that idea of calling, but it's also where we get the word vocation. And certainly Merriam-Webster does a great job in giving us an idea as to what we mean by calling. As you look at it, it's that strong inner impulse toward a certain or a particular action, but it's got that divine piece within it, that divine motivation. And so we really, again, our heart's desire is to kind of move you toward that concept of pursuing the called life. You don't have to hang around with us very long to hear that we actively believe that God is involved in all the different areas of your life, including in your work pursuits. In fact, our key verse for our ministry is Ephesians 2:10. For we are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God has prepared in advance for us to do. As we break that down, we really see three important points that go into a calling. First of all, we are God's workmanship. And the phrase I like to use with that is, we have a divine design. So as we talk about taking stock of who you are, and we talk about your personality, your interests, your values, your skills, your passions, the circumstances that you have, different experiences that you've gone through, all of that forms together to give you that unique thumbprint of God on you. You may have some similarities in your personality, your interests, or your values to other people, but the sum total of that is unique, and God has created each and every one of us. The second is created in Christ Jesus to do good works. That very clearly gives us the idea that work is scriptural, work is biblical. If you go back to Adam even before the fall, you'll find that God had work for Adam to do in the Garden of Eden. And we're actually going to have an entire morning spent on God's view of work in a couple weeks, so I'm just going to glance on that one at this point. And then finally, which God prepared in advance for us to do. This gives us a clear view that God has a purpose and a plan for us, and we call that plan and that purpose a calling. Let's unpack a few more details. First of all, as you look at both the focus and the direction, you can see a pretty significant difference in the job, career, and calling. A job tends to be very, very present-oriented, and it's all about what the employer wants. As you look at a career, it could have the job within it where you're going to work and you are satisfying what an employer wants, but it's much more directed by you, and it's very much future-focused. Where are you going down that path? If you think back to that definition, that gives you that idea. We're proceeding in a path. In a calling, we're still paying attention to the present. We may be in a job, we may be in a career, but we're actually looking at a very much of an eternal perspective, and it's much more towards where is God calling you? What is His purpose in your life? A few more distinctions include for the job, it's really oftentimes singular or just a few tasks that you're responsible for. You go to work, you get it done, and then that position, as you change that position, it changes. As you change employers, that job changes. Within the career, again, you may be having a job, but it's, again, very much that idea of multiple tracks or tasks within that one role, within that track. So think back to my example of Jenna, where she was looking at continuing education. She was looking at professional involvement. That's very much going on as we're pursuing a career. And so it's about the position we have, but it's also about some other elements. And so you can see we're looking at typically focused on increased responsibility, increased movement potentially in salary, and then that upward progression. And we're very much tracking ourselves. Again, it's very self-focused. Finally, within the calling, it's as I say there, it's multitask, multi-track, multi-role. Well, the big picture there is it's our life work. It's all the different pieces of our life coming together, woven together to give us that direction. So we're not just focused on our work. We're focused on all the different roles we have to play as a parent, as a spouse, as a Christian, as a friend, and as a citizen in an organization. It's also part of a transcendent cause. So we're thinking about looking upward, as we talked about earlier in that definition. It has that divine component too. And I mentioned the divine design earlier, and there are definitely some related concepts, and that was part of the confusing part that we're hoping to kind of clarify with you, in that, we talk about purpose and significance and passion and vision. All of those really do fall into this concept of a calling. Craig mentioned a little bit about my background, and I can certainly talk to that I've been in each and every one of those different areas. So, for instance, for the job, I definitely pursued jobs where I needed to make ends meet, or I needed the experience and potentially even learned about through that job that I really didn't like what that was, and so that was very insightful for me. As I got out of graduate school, I definitely pursued a career and had an opportunity, with every couple of years, have that new promotion, being involved with a national organization, speaking at a national meeting, being, chairing committees and things like that, and also through some continuing education. And really, as Craig mentioned, kind of throughout all that, I had this opportunity, this feeling, this drive to help people realize kind of that background that they have, how they're wired, and where that might lead them into choosing work that's in great alignment with how they're wired, as opposed to making decisions based on what are the hot jobs, what's the best salary, or my parents think that I should do this. And so in my career, when I was with the Top 5 MBA program, I had an opportunity to get a lot of great training on personality testing and interest in inventories, a number of different things like that. Well, and so I was definitely in that career track, moving in that career track. We relocated to Austin, and I actually had an opportunity to stay home with my kids, and that was something that I was really wanting to do, and so that was a great opportunity. But as we came to start to attend church here several years into it, I had an opportunity to try to work with a group called AIM, which stands for Assessment for Inventory and Ministry. And in that class, we were helping people figure out where it was that they wanted to serve in ministry in the church. And lo and behold, that wonderful opportunity I had to get all this great training at a Top 5 MBA program, where at that institution I was usually helping people get a job with a higher salary or that next power position. I was able to utilize that here in ministry in helping people figure out how they wanted to serve in ministry themselves. And then 4 years ago, the opportunity for me to come and work here with Craig kind of put it all together. And so I was able to continue in helping people make career choices, but really bring in all of the different pieces of their lives. And so it was kind of interesting to me as I reflected on this, is that actually my calling, as I've kind of just come to unpack it, is to help people figure out their calling. And so I'm really excited to just, again, start and bring the idea to you today. Another story that clearly outlines kind of how we can approach things with a different perspective is a great story about Sir Christopher Wren and the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral. Sir Christopher Wren was an architect in the 1600s, and he actually had as his heart's desire was to build a cathedral, and he'd been rejected a lot. He was not given the opportunity to do this until the huge London fire in 1666 took out St. Paul's Cathedral, and he was given the opportunity to rebuild it. He did this with great fervor, great interest, and was involved in every single detail of rebuilding this cathedral. And the story is that he would migrate around talking to different workers, and most of the time they didn't really know who he was. They didn't have the media that we have around here, and so they didn't see people's pictures plastered all over the place. And so they didn't know who some of these people were that were migrating in and out and watching this facility be erected. And so the story is that he approached 3 different workers in one specific day. And the first worker he approached was bending over, laboring very diligently with brick and mortar. And he said to that gentleman, "Sir, what are you doing?" And that gentleman replied, "I'm making a brick." He moved to another part of the facility where he sees a gentleman who's working about waist high, working with a lot of energy, and also working with brick and mortar. And he approaches that person and says, "Sir, what are you doing?" And that person says, "I'm building a wall." He transitions to another point in the facility, and he approaches this person. This person is working up high. He's working with brick and mortar. And he approaches him and says, "Sir, what are you doing?" And the person replies and says, "I'm building a cathedral for Sir Christopher Wren and for the Almighty." Each and every one of those workers was doing the very same thing, in the fact that they were working diligently, they were skilled, they were all working with brick and mortar. So really, they were all doing the same thing. But what a difference of perspective. What a difference a vision has of when you're pursuing something with that big picture in mind. And that's what I like to think of a calling is giving us that big picture. So even when we're in the kind of the trenches of working with mud and brick and mortar, we have that vision of where we're going. There's another historical part of this story that I think has great application for us as well. The story is that it took 45 years for this cathedral to be fully erected and dedicated. But it was utilized 20 years before that final dedication. What's our application? We don't have to think that we're complete before we start using and working within our calling. When we get that vision, we just need to go for it. And in fact, we hear that God will continue to grow and develop our gifting as our skills as we use them more and more. As I had the opportunity to really do this research on the concept of calling, one of the things I listened to was a wonderful sermon by Tony Evans. And if you don't know him, he's a very dynamic speaker and pastor out of a large church in Dallas. And his view on calling was really excellent, and I just had to share it with y'all. So first of all, one of his definitions I thought was one of the most succinct but powerful. A calling is God's directed purpose in your life. I thought that was really helpful to just kind of get those words and tie that up together. But he makes 6 different points as he talks about why we would be interested in finding out about a calling. First of all, that it addresses fulfillment issues. As human beings, we're going to seek fulfillment. We're going to seek fulfillment from the world. We're going to self-indulge to find fulfillment. Typically, those are artificial ways of being fulfilled. When we're pursuing God's that type of fulfillment is authentic fulfillment. And that's when we're going to start to experience that significance and meaning on a daily basis. It also answers the issue of direction. We have just a myriad of opportunities bombarding us at different times that we could spend time going from thing to thing. And without a clear direction, we can be a ping pong ball and just move from thing to thing without clear direction, and it can be very frustrating. I've worked with some of you who've gone through Design and Focus and realized that that's what you've been doing is you've been pursuing your career in kind of that ping pong ball fashion. Well, once you get that directed purpose in your life, it's no longer the ping pong, and you're able to evaluate each and every one of those opportunities as pursue God's directed purpose in my life. It also answers the question about stability. Hard stuff is going to come up. We're going to have difficult circumstances. Y'all are in here potentially with difficult circumstances. We have difficult circumstances that come up in our life. But one of the things that Tony Evans says is the worst day in our calling, we're still called. And so it allows us to potentially endure those tough days. And when we know we're called, but we know it's a hard circumstance, that should help us to endure it in a more effective and meaningful way. Understanding our calling also addresses the issue of significance. In Psalm 139, the scripture tells us that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. I just shared with you kind of my words I like to use is that we each have a divine design or that unique thumbprint of God. We are unique. We do matter. God has a plan and a purpose for us, so we are significant. People wander around and feel insignificant when they don't have that God-directed purpose in their life. But once they get that, it suddenly clears that I'm here for a specific purpose. I don't need to be successful at what someone else needs to be successful for. I need to be successful at the work I've been given, at the direction I've been given. It also answers the question of provision. God provides for what he calls. And just as I mentioned kind of in my story, that, I had this training, the University of Chicago very graciously paid for me to get all this great training that I in turn now get to use here at Hill Country Bible Church and with Job Seekers Ministry. Little did I know that long time ago when I took that training that I would be applying it in this kind of facility and capacity. But God knew. He directed that. And so we can oftentimes look back and see where he's directed us in different ways, but he's going to provide for what he calls. And then finally, it answers the issue of time. Again, very much like that direction piece, we have so many demands on our time. And many, many things are asking for our time that are good things. But are they the right things? Are they the things that we've been called to do? And those are the questions that we have to answer. And the clearer we are in God's directed purpose in our lives, the better that we can answer make those decisions. Another person that is very clearly called, and one of the clear ones in the Bible, is Moses. Some of you see that picture and you've watched the movie The Ten Commandments, and you can hear that voice of God calling to Moses out of the burning bush. Moses is a huge person in the Bible, and he literally was called out of it. God really did call him out of a burning bush and gave him his direction that he wanted him to lead the Israelites from the bondage of being slaves in Egypt to the promised land. And so a couple other little pictures in my scrapbook here are helping, giving the Israelites the Ten Commandments, as well as parting the Red Sea so that the Israelites could pass through as they escaped from the Egyptians. One of the things we like to say is, well, it was so easy for Moses. He had a burning bush. He had a clear idea of what God was calling him to do. And that's true. But I'd like to suggest that sometimes God gives us our own burning bushes that we need to just start to pay attention to. In my personal life, we moved here when my children were very, very young. In fact, they hadn't started school yet. And so my husband and I, both have graduate degrees, and education's a really big deal. And so one of the things we did was interviewed all the different principals at all the different neighborhoods that we were going to potentially choose a house in. So we ultimately chose this neighborhood that had a great school that was a National Blue Ribbon exemplary elementary school. And we started coming to church here and started hearing about people talking about homeschooling, and that was actually a very foreign concept from the Midwest area. That wasn't something that was done so much. And so I have a very clear memory of standing on my front porch, talking to a very dear friend of mine, saying, God would have to come here in a burning bush before I'd ever think about homeschooling. Well, fast forward a couple years, and one of my sons is in the gifted program, incredibly bright, but also has a couple learning issues, and he was not thriving in this National Blue Ribbon exemplary school. And so to this mom's heart, to my husband and my heart, that actually was a pretty clear call. That was our burning bush, that maybe we needed to look at some change. And ultimately, that change was that I homeschooled for 11 years. So I'm sure there's a whole other story about, we don't ever say I will never or those kinds of things, but that's for another time. Couple applications, though, that we can learn from Moses that I also personally experienced was God does provide for what he calls, just like we talked about. You look at that picture and you see that Moses has a staff, and that was an important tool for him to use. God provided his brother to help him speak. He provided Joshua to help lead when he was older. Countless things in the Bible where God provided for Moses to be able to fulfill his calling. That was certainly the case for us within homeschooling. We had many opportunities to do some classes outside of my teaching, particularly science and math wasn't my thing, and so I was very excited to have somebody to teach that. Even a football team, which was a great thing for my youngest son, was a provision for us to be able to homeschool. But another application that Moses gives us is that not everybody's going to recognize and understand your calling. Certainly for Moses, Pharaoh didn't. And even the Israelites, man, did they like to grumble and complain a lot against Moses of what he was called to do. And I certainly can tell you that I had friends that just kind of shook their head and thought we were crazy as we started to homeschool. And particularly family members, they didn't get it. I think they finally started to come on board when my oldest was accepted to college with scholarships, that maybe it was going to be okay and that we weren't ruining our kids. But the bottom line is that, if we hear this calling, then that's what we need to obey, even if it's going to be hard, even if it's going to be different than what we potentially thought. And kind of at the end of the story, again, I mentioned that I just had the 11th year of homeschooling. We just graduated my youngest from homeschooling. One of the scriptures that Craig has used several times is, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And my friend that I stood on that front porch with gave me a graduation present as we finished homeschooling, and in it was that scripture, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Now, here clearly, I'm not saying everybody should homeschool. In fact, if anybody ever does an informational interview with me about homeschooling, I clearly state it is a calling. It is hard. It is a calling. It's not for everybody. But, it was interesting to me. I told you earlier kind of about my calling to work with people in the homeschooling community. I had the opportunity to start teaching classes on career direction for juniors and seniors. And in fact, I still do consulting with families on helping them with career direction and with college advising. There also are definitely myths about our calling. And one of those is, I am unemployed, so I must not be within my work calling. Some of you may be sitting there thinking that very same thing. The reality is that your old work may not have been within your work calling, and you may be drawing closer to your calling now as you have an opportunity to potentially assess that divine design, for you to think about, where am I being led? Another faulty myth that we have is that in order to live a called life, I either have to be a pastor or to go to some far-off country and be a missionary. And that's not true at all. God calls each of us within our circumstances, within our geography, and within our fields. And finally, and this is particularly true when you're in kind of that career path mentality, is as you make potentially a change, and potentially that change means you're going to make less money or it's less responsibility. People can feel like they're on a downward spiral and they're not in their calling, when the reality is that may be very much what God's calling you to do. In order to have balance in your life, in order to encompass all those different roles in your life, you may be needing to take a position that's a little bit different in terms of what that normal career progression would be. So to summarize, a couple points I'd want to point out is, first of all, this definition, and it's not truly a definition, it's really just some statements that John Maxwell made in this most recent book he just published in October, November timeframe, but I just loved what he had to say about a calling. The work I do is a calling in my life. I think I was born for this. It relies on my strength. It gives me the energy. It allows me to make a difference in the lives of others. It fulfills me and gives me a touch of the eternal. Boy, if we can have those things going on in our work life, in the areas that we're serving, isn't that awesome to think about that I was born for this, that I have strengths, I'm impacting the lives of others, and it gives me the touch of the eternal. So kind of to recap, calling does include your divine design. I've mentioned that. It gives your life meaning and purpose, and you're going to accomplish this with a plan. So kind of the tagline that we've developed here for Living the Called Life is an acronym for that life is living for eternity, living fully engaged. And that's what we'd like to have for each and every one of you. As I mentioned before, as we think about a calling, it really takes into account all these different parts of our lives. So let's get practical. You all got, as a handout, hopefully, calling wheel. Why don't you pull that out? Some of you may have seen this before. It's very commonly used within the life coaching circles. And so we wanted to have an opportunity for you to kind of just get really practical within this. As we talk about calling, we're talking about each of these different areas along the wheel. So your work calling, your spiritual calling, your family, social, fitness and health, community calling, financial calling, and then personal growth and development. And the concept here is that, as we look at this wheel where we have each of these different pieces of our life coming together, very often there are times where we're spending a whole lot of energy toward one thing, potentially to the detriment of another. Probably the most significant example of that is your classic workaholic person, where they're spending so much time and energy at work and potentially making a huge amount of money, but they've had several failed marriages, their kids hate them, their health is just terrible. And so that's kind of the extreme example of what we would not want our wheel to look like, right? That is not the abundant life that God would have for us. As we look at the three different people we talked about at the beginning, first of all, as we talk about Matt, it sounded like from his bio that he was spending a ton of time dealing with work to the detriment of his family, his marriage, and his kids. Now with the opportunity for him to have more time at home, he was actually investing time in that, so that might actually have been a little bit more balanced. But he was suffering from not having any time to spend with God or any time in dealing with health or his community. As we think about Jenna, she clearly was the MBA person, she was clearly spending a lot of time within the work, within personal development, and probably finances. We don't hear that specifically, but she talked specifically about kind of the downside of social and fitness. We didn't hear on some of the others to really know. And finally, for Sean, he was in the job search for the third time, and so you'd think that work piece would be down pretty significantly, but yet we heard that he was going to be spending time investing in understanding more of his wiring or that divine design, and so that actually wasn't such a detriment. We heard he was trying to spend more time with God, with his family. Didn't hear a whole lot about social and fitness, but he was serving in his community. He was working to become debt-free, and I think you could say that some of that divine design piece is also part of your personal development as well. So it was more of a well-rounded. We think the ideal picture here is a perfectly rounded circle. When you think of the wheel, a perfect circle is going to roll really smoothly. One that has more dips in it, so as you look at the example of where it's been filled out down on the bottom right, that's going to be a little bit more of a bumpy ride. And so, of course, as we look at our whole life picture, we would love this to be a perfect circle. The reality is at different points in time in our lives, we have to spend more time with one thing or another. If you've got young kids, I can tell you that family calling is going to have a lot more energy than actually now that my husband and I are empty nesters. They come home for a month, it's pretty intense, but then they're gone. And so the energy is spent is differently. Kind of doing a little bit of an inventory. How are you doing on this? And it gives you directions at the bottom of the page. They're not up on the screen here, but they're at the bottom of the page, where it gives you directions of, just assess yourself in each of these different areas as to how well you're doing. Where are you spending time? Where are you spending energy? Or what's being kind of put on a back burner, and what do you need to think about? So I'm going to give you a couple minutes. If anybody has a question, raise their hand. I'll migrate around. Again, I just feel like this is one of those things that you want to review on an ongoing basis. This is not a once and done type of exercise. In fact, I would strongly recommend that even once a month or once a quarter you bring it out. And so the idea is not to beat yourself up, first of all. If you've got some kind of lower areas, it's to give you inspiration and help and hope. But it's also to look at it more of a big picture that through the course of a year, am I letting this slide? Well, if I'm letting something slide over the course of a year, then that probably needs some significant attention. So I think it's a very, very helpful tool. As I had an opportunity to do research, read lots and lots of things, listened to lots of things, and then we also asked Danny, who's done even more. And so these are just a couple selected resources that we might suggest if you're wanting to dig deeper. They gave us a really good perspective and view of this concept of calling and your life work. But again, I realize and understand that I've just started to skim the surface, and so I'm excited about these 4 weeks all together, as well as the workshops as they all come together to help you in living a called life. We'd love to work with you on that, but what's really important to us is that you do start thinking about it. We hope we whetted your appetite even just by talking about it this morning and by praying with you about this, that you can start really thinking about what is your purpose, what is your calling in life. And with that, can I just pray for you? Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank you for being our Creator, and knowing that you do have a plan and a purpose for us, plans to prosper us and not to harm us, plans to give us a future and a hope, Lord, as we learn about in Jeremiah. I just ask for each and every one of us in this room, Lord, to seek your face, to seek to understand more about how you've designed us, your amazing plan in our lives, Lord, that I pray that we could listen to you and be obedient to follow, Lord. And I just pray for each and every job seeker, Lord, to have the abundant life of living the called life. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.